Your election.
Oh my lord.
Nice, refreshing. Are we going?
We are.
Starting? Thumbs up.
Carols
Hello,
are over.
everybody. Welcome, and if you're watching online, welcome. And if you're watching online, you can leave questions. I've got an iPad here, and I believe you have a link which will allow you to contribute to this wonderful event. It's our review of the year 2024. We started the year with Keir Starmer, favourite to be next Prime Minister. We end the year now with who is the bookie's favourite to be next Prime Minister. Do you know? It is Nigel Farage. They're not saying it's likely. They're putting it at about 1 in 3. But that is where we end the year. I went back and looked at some of the front pages from the beginning of the year to see if there was any indication in them of what was coming up this year. And I think the answer is no. The Times led with a story that was no need for passport under new border plan. We still await the new border plan to be implemented. It's a kind of fantasy that we have sometimes in this country. The Telegraph had on their front page, Tory fury at Dominic Cummings' return. I suppose we're over that particular drama now. And the Mirror, in fact, did have a headline on January the 1st that reflected something that was quite big in the year. They led on assisted dying, give us the choice. Esther Ranson steps up, bid for free vote. Anyway, it has been, I think, fair to say, like most years since 2014, an interesting year. We continue to be taken aback by surprises, as indeed in the last events of the last weekend have, I think, taken everybody aback. We continue to be taken aback by things that are not really surprises, like the election of Donald Trump. There was no reason to be surprised by that. It had been foretold by the bookies and by polls, and it came to deliver. The great winners of the year are those who invested in Bitcoin. If you invested in Bitcoin on January the 1st, you'd be up 120%. And then the other is Elon Musk. If you Google Elon Musk, for the last 12 months, there have been 130 million different Google entries. For the 12 months prior, it was only 58 million. So he has also, like Bitcoin, gone up 120% in mentioned in Google returns, and only about a third of those are actually from him talking about himself. Anyway, the losers, so if Bitcoin and Elon Musk are winners, the losers seem to have been potentially anyone running a country, anyone with a serious job to do, actually making decisions. Terrible, terrible year for people having to do that. And then one of the surprises of this year has been how people who did win often looked like they didn't really enjoy it or hadn't felt like they looked like more like losers, and some of the ones who lost looked like winners. Anyway, we have a lot to talk about in this discussion, and we have three excellent panelists from UK and a Change in Europe. We have Anand, of course, the director, Professor of European Politics and Foreign Affairs here at KCL. Jill, Senior Research Fellow here, and was Programme Director at IFG, former civil servant in the Treasury, number 10 in DEFRA. And Jonathan, many of you will know as well, Professor of Economics and Public Policy at King's, and was Director of the National Institute, NISA, and had jobs as Chief Economist at the Cabinet Office and DWP. I do want you to contribute in the room. There will be a roving mic. Rather than us have a discussion and then open it up, I will come to you on some of the themes that we talk about and see if you want to contribute or add or ask a question on some of those, and similarly with the questions from those outside. But I think we should probably start with UK politics, because there was no surprise that Labour won. That was foretold. But I think it's the sort of, what do you make of the first 6 months? It's actually 5 months. What do you make of the first 5 months of Labour government? Jonathan first.
So I think there's something of a disjunction between the sort of quite terrible public presentation and what's actually happened. I mean, on the former, I think it's slightly bizarre that the government, that Labour don't seem to have realised that the media, particularly the conservative inclined press, would immediately turn on them the moment they got to power and that everything they did would be subject to very, very detailed scrutiny. So, and I think that has led to some quite obvious and avoidable own goals around things like accepting freebies and so on. On the substance, I think there's two things. On the sort of big tax and spending macro choices, I think essentially they've made the best of a bad job. They put up taxes by quite a lot, while at the same time at least maintaining a fig leaf of not obviously breaking their promises, their manifesto promises, although that's funny. But then, all the polls suggest that the public expected them to put up taxes by a bit, and that's what they've done. And they put up spending by a bit, or by quite a lot actually, which I think was entirely justified and necessary. I think that some of the criticism of their spending plans from the IFS and others, that they're putting up a lot, and this they're spending now, but this inevitably means austerity in 2 or 3 times, is somewhat misplaced, because I think actually from an economics perspective it makes a lot of sense. The NHS, for example, clearly needs a significant infusion of cash now, but it's also seen quite a large fall in productivity over the last few years. So I think there is a very good case for saying actually what you need to do is invest now, reform now, improve productivity, and if you get that right, then you won't need the same sort of spending increases in 3 or 4 or 5 years' time. So I don't think that's necessary. I think some of the criticism there is somewhat unfair. But the big test really will be, it seems to me on the sort of tax and spending stuff, look, if they genuinely take the money that they've raised in extra taxes and use it to significantly improve public services from the dire state that they were left with, then the public, I think, will largely forgive them for, putting up taxes and arguably breaking their manifesto promises. If they don't, however, deliver, if they've just put up taxes without improving public services enough, then they will quite rightly get the blame. So a lot rides on actually a spending review which genuinely directs money, not just money, but meaningful reform and improvement at what people want around things like health, and in particular crime, criminal justice. I'll stop there.
Before I ask Jill and Anand on the same question, can I just take it that all 3 of you regret the degree to which they made binding pledges in the election campaign that massively constrained their budget options, that left them with a really difficult, if you're going to raise 40 billion and you're not going to raise employee, national insurance, income tax, VAT or corporation tax, can I just take it, just on that very narrow one in a sentence?
I mean, I remember being slightly taken aback with the second national insurance cut when they were so far ahead in the polls that they didn't say, hang on a sec, we're not going to back this one. That one surprised me, though I fully understand it. Because, I mean, in a sense, you say no one was surprised that they won. I think they were. I mean, I think Labour are always surprised when they win. They can be as far ahead in the polls as you want. But, you talk to Labour inside, it's like, we'll blow this. Something's going to go wrong. There'll be a Sheffield. There'll be something will happen. So I think that real sense, and you could almost talk to people in Labour who were saying, well, we can't prepare for government because that would curse it. Because we're so prone to lose the election. And I think so
they really thought they needed to make that pledge. And Jill...
Well, I think it's quite interesting if you sort of replay. So if Rachel Reeves had done as Anand said and said, well, that was really very unwise, Jeremy, and we'll reverse it. I think it's really quite interesting, and maybe your best place to answer this, Evan, she said, because you might as well be a participant as well as a questioner. What would people have said, actually, if the government had actually taken the same amount of money but done it through employee national insurance? Would people who all claim not to have noticed the employee national insurance cut, I will busk while Evan fiddles with his microphone, were the people who basically said, well, we didn't notice the change in national insurance, I'm certainly not going to give you any credit for it, Conservatives, would they all be sitting there and saying, yeah, well, actually, we don't notice it being taken away either, or would they notice that hit their pay packet? So I think it's really interesting, if they'd done that, whatever. I think one of the things that I think Rachel Reeves may have underestimated as I think she probably thought employer national insurance was easier to do, because I think the sort of reaction of the business community, the sort of breakdown,
the charities, the
care
charity,
homes, well, it's all those knock-on effects from all we've heard since the budget is another very sensitive sector saying, we can't cope with this, we are going to shut, and you choose your pick and mix from hospices, care homes, every charity you've ever heard of, every restaurant you've ever heard of, and things like that. So I think it's really interesting how the politics would have played if they had actually gone ahead with a reversal of that.
I would have said, we are not going to raise the rate of income tax. No way are we raising the rate of income tax, which is what
Even
Gordon
though it's
Brown
our best
did.
tax, Evan, as you perfectly well know.
Even because that still leaves you all the other taxes to raise. And that's what Gordon Brown did in 2001, isn't it? And then massively hiked national insurance. And that would have sounded like you're making a pledge without making a binding pledge. But Jonathan, just on that one thing, because I actually think Labour pledging not to raise those taxes in the election was a seminal moment of this year, because it really has constrained this whole parliament and the rebuilding and the rejuvenation of the state in the way that they want to conduct it.
I think it was a mistake, although, as Anand says, you can sort of see why. I'm not sure it's as much of a constraint. I mean, I think, there's a lot of stuff that they could have done without breaking the pledge. They could have, if you wanted growth-enhancing tax reforms, you could do a lot of stuff around the VAT threshold, the fact that the income tax schedule for people earning over about £80,000 is a complete and absolute nightmare, and could be reformed in a way that was revenue neutral and would be good for growth. And they have ducked, in some ways I'm more annoyed that they didn't do reform than that they made a stupid pledge for political motivations, which frankly I'm not qualified to judge on whether.
It's quite interesting that Rachel Reeves makes such a great play of being an economist, but actually you might have thought that sort of some of this sort of economic thinking, the case for actually, reforming the tax system so it performs a bit better. We've still got the sort of Merley's doorstop, which is only 12, 13 years old, or whenever it was published or whatever, so we don't get another one from the IFS for 20 years.
This is a
massive thing saying how could you reform the tax system in a revenue neutral way that would actually improve efficiency.
This is also their hobby horse. We could be here for days.
You thought that Rachel,
Anyway, look, I don't want us to get too caught up in the tax. I did want us to talk about that tax pledge. We've heard Jonathan on the first 6 months. I want Jill and Anand, briefly if possible, on your scorecard of Labour's first month.
So I think, I'm going to give you very quickly, Evan. I think that actually there are a lot of individual Secretary of State who've taken charge of their departments and performing quite competently and getting on, as you'd expect, but it has been surprisingly overshadowed by an underpowered and dysfunctional centre.
Okay. And is that resolved now? Obviously they had to feel their way. They had Sue Gray, they had
we've got a new cabinet secretary.
They had Simon Case. And
so I think we don't know yet. I think we'll wait to see. That's one of the big question marks over 2025 is, has number 10 now got its act together? And I think, interestingly, will they get more interested in policy? I don't get the impression that this number 10 is desperately interested in policy, or that Keir Starmer, beyond criminal justice, is very interested in policy, but I'm prepared to have people take me on that. And will they actually perform any sort of challenge to Rachel Reeves in the Treasury, which I think is quite an interesting dynamic that we've seen, that he seems to be prepared to completely subcontract all economic policy decisions to Rachel Reeves.
Okay, and then Anand, first 6 months.
It's very, very early days. I think one of the things, I think they have made some mistakes. I think the tone of the early days, the sort of doom and gloom, was a mistake. I think I'd have liked them to start telling us a story about where they're taking us rather than just repeat ad nauseum how rubbish things are. I think one of the things that worries me about where we are, and we don't talk about it enough, is just how utterly dependent their plans are on things totally outside their control. We've got a very unstable world at the moment, as we saw with the sort of cost of living crisis after the Ukraine inflation. We're so reliant on things globally going well to achieve growth. That scares me slightly. But I'd be loath to give a score as yet, because it is very, very
And
early days, to be honest.
I think they've invited us to take it as long term. I mean, Keir Starmer keeps saying, I'm not going to kind of engage in gimmicks. And
I mean, the frightening question is whether delivery matters anymore. I mean, you know, if you look at what happened in the United States, it's just like, is the anti-incumbent thing just so strong that actually, even if you do get sort of marginal improvements in public service and a little bit of growth, are you going to be thanked for it in 4 or 5 years? I mean, are electorates just behaving in an anti-incumbent way? I mean, that's the real fear, it seems to me.
Well, there's that old phrase, Keynesian phrase, about markets can remain irrational longer than you remain solvent. So if you bet against the market, even if you're right, the market can be wrong for long. You're bust before you approved right. And it may be that long-termism in government is just very difficult because the pressures are you'll be out of office before anyone recognises.
Which is unfortunate because
you've done.
If you go through the macro problems we face, whether it's ageing societies, whether it's the climate crisis, whether it's the challenge of technology, whether it's things like social care, they're all long-term problems which require long-term solutions. So this is
that's fine, but I mean, I have slightly more faith in the British public, and and also that some of this stuff you can do in the short term. Waiting lists have gone from being okay in the first half of this parliament to being bad just before the pandemic to being totally and completely out of control. That is something that, with money and actually a Secretary of State and people who are competent and focus on the things that matter, and that part is very difficult, you can turn around in 2 or 3 years, and I refuse to believe that the British public actually wouldn't give you quite a lot of credit for reversing it. The same is true for crime policing and criminal justice. More money and proper management. These are not things where it's not a question. This is not HS2. It's not going to take 20 years to do that. You just need money and proper competence and management. Those things are not easy. Neither of them is easy. But if you do it, they are perfectly doable in 2 or 3 years. And if you do it, I genuinely think you would get a reasonable amount of credit for it.
I mean, I hope you're right. Well, all I'm saying is there is a weird mood out there which is very anti-incumbent, and which, because of the kind of anti-politics mood that seems quite pervasive across the Western world, means that sometimes politicians don't seem to get the credit for stuff they've done. People aren't willing to give credit. Now, maybe I'm wrong. I hope I am.
And they bank the credit and say, but now I want the other party to. I mean, it's a really big and interesting question, that, as to where voters go when things get better.
It's a sad state of affairs if Jonathan's got more faith in human nature than me.
Out of interest, I know Anand said he wouldn't score this government. I'm going to read a list of numbers from 10 down. So we'll start at 10. And I want you to put your hand up if you're in the room on this is marks out of 10 for the first 6 months. And I'm going to read them fairly quickly, and we just want to see where the centre of gravity is. So think about your number, marks out of 10. 10. 9. 8.
No one wants to be afraid.
One hand up on 8. 7.
8 up there.
It's like a Dutch auction. We're beginning to see some hands. 6. 5. I think that's probably the sort of median. 4. 3. Yeah, and I'm not even going to bother with 2, 1, and 0.
Can we get Joel and Mike to justify his 10?
I'm taking 5 there as the kind of median score. Right, let's focus, though, on one very narrow aspect where, to me, from the outside, it looks like nothing's happened. This is your area, you guys, the European reset. What is happening? Where's it going? Is it going well?
Lots has happened in the sense that I think the relation at times under the Conservatives, particularly Boris Johnson, this was a zero-sum relationship. We're doing well if you're doing badly, and vice versa. That has been changed. That tone has been changed. They've done some really good things, I think, like instituting regular summits, which was missing from the Johnson deal. So it would be wrong to say nothing has happened. But I think in terms of the substance of the reset, they've been slow out of the traps. And one of the problems with that is they've allowed the European Commission to fill the gap where their reset agenda should have been.
I think that's right. I think they've done some quite good internal things. I think actually bringing back Europe to be coordinated from the Cabinet Office under Nick Thomas-Symonds is the right move. Apparently, Simon Case held up the advertisement for a job as second permanent secretary to coordinate that to be the EU Sherpa. That job ad closed at the weekend, and apparently, if we believe the FT, they're luring back an ex-Treasury official from his very well-paid job in the city to come and do that and bring some EU clout. And I think it's not before time. They need to do that to start working out what the UK's strategy is going to be, because they, as Anand said, they've let the EU draw up a document saying we'll have to settle fish first. And you think, you go back to the sort of Brexit negotiations when we were sort of blindsided on sequencing, said, yeah, they don't really mean putting Ireland up front and things like that. And you just think you sort of, no cherry picking, all these sort of familiar mantras come back. It was quite interesting. Anna was pointing out that Rachel Reeves, with her trip to the Eurogroup finance ministers on Monday, was going back to the line that didn't go down very well last time about you cutting off your noses to spite your face by denying yourselves access to our excellent deep capital markets, which are critical for your growth. So we seem to be going back to a lot of these familiar tunes. But I do think they do need to get their act together. And they are, we talked about boxing yourselves in. As far as we can see, apart from fish, which will be disproportionately important relative to its size in the economy, which is like rounds to nothing. But apart from fish, the big EU demand is what Anand will deride as a gap year for EU bureaucrats' kids, but it is the big demand as this youth mobility deal. And the government insists on keeping on saying, Nick Thomas-Symonds yesterday was at Law's Europe Affairs Committee, and he said, well, we can't do that because it would add to the immigration figures, and we wouldn't, You used to think, don't box yourselves in. There are a million ways of dressing these things up, which will enable you to make the inevitable concession you will have to make on this if you want to get something else out.
But how many Labour MPs are against it? I would have thought
I think tending
all of
to
them
zero,
would be
but
in favour of a youth mobility.
I don't think this is aimed at Labour MPs, though, is it? It's Morgan McSweeney's reading of what the new voting coalition looks like. Though Anand, or maybe Paula, who's in the front row, could tell us whether that really is critical to the voting coalition, whether having a bunch of EU students sitting around. I think it is more difficult, obviously. Someone like Kings would probably be screaming blue murder if they actually let lots of EU students in, displacing overseas students and only paying UK domestic students fees. Because I don't think that would be great news for the university sector.
If they replace them, if they're additional in some way, it's a slightly different thing.
If they replace British, if they're replacements or whatever. But anyway, so I think it's quite interesting to see where they're going. But they need to have a view on what they can concede, what they can't, where they want to be, how they're going to use this really interesting piece of legislation they're introducing, which gives them secondary powers to voluntarily align with quite a lot of EU regulation. David Frost keeps on complaining nobody's talking about it. We're talking about it, so just read our stuff, David. So I think there's some quite, interesting movements there, but it doesn't really sort of come together with big clarity. So hopefully next year we'll get our act together.
I do have a worry for them, which is I think they probably thought the way into a relationship with the EU is the world's very complicated, Russia's horrible, and post-American election, Trump is going to make life awkward. So Britain and Europe need to come together, particularly on security, and with that we'll do a veterinary agreement and make our economies a bit stronger. And the Europeans seem to be at every juncture saying we're not going to do that. No way.
Well, you're right in the sense that they're saying we Europeans need to be more self-reliant economically, to do more for ourselves. The big question is, what do they mean by we Europeans? Right. The danger is they mean member states or members of the single market, and they don't mean the continent. Jonathan,
on the EU reset, any thoughts?
I would just agree with Jill. I think, without talking about the merits or otherwise of a youth mobility scheme, if the government, and this goes back to Jill's other point about the centre needs to get a grip. If you're serious, Keir Starmer and Nick needs to say to Yvette Cooper, sorry, this is an important part of the agenda, you're going to make it work. And if he's not prepared to do that, then on this, and then you'll get the same thing will happen on fish and a bunch of other things, and it will not amount to anything.
Any questions in the hall on sort of Labour, its months of government. I'll open up to more general questions towards the end, but any specific thoughts or comments on Labour's first government? We'll just take one over here. You literally diagonally across from where the microphone is. That's it. We'll whisk it round. And remember, at home, I've got some questions here. I'll just take this one. Yeah.
Thanks very much. Two things about the first 5 months. One is, why did the government repeat the mistakes of all its predecessors and put all the health and social care money straight into the hospitals and the health service and do absolutely nothing about social care? So they're just destined to repeat the problems that have happened so far. The other, I've forgotten the second one.
Come on, Sarah.
But
whenever you say I'm going to do
there was a third one.
things,
Well, there was a third one. Jill said that Keir Starmer seems to be obsessed with criminal justice, but I haven't seen anything that he's done about criminal justice. I think it's still broken, and I can't see anything he's doing to actually fix the criminal or the rest of the justice system, which is completely broken.
Well, he's appointed Timpson and Gork to very
Actually, can I come back to the second point I was going to make
very quickly,
very quickly on tax? I agree with Evan. Stupid for them to have constrained
I didn't
themselves.
say that. I was putting that as a question.
Okay, I'm sure you.
Just for the record.
But given that they have, why on earth did they, with the farmers, why on earth didn't they just put petrol tax up a tiny bit, which would have applied to everybody, and not get themselves into that ghastly trap of the inheritance thing? Because if they'd put petrol tax up, it would have messed up.
And that's
the rural
another. There's a very
communities.
interesting example of a caution on the part of this government on, isn't it, Anand? I mean, it's a sort of, we dare not do things which create.
Yeah, I mean, the
bad
fuel
headlines.
duty was just ridiculous. But on the farmers, I've got no problem with what they've done. And actually, if I were Morgan McSweeney, coming out of this budget, if the biggest single thing that the Telegraph and the Mail have to moan about are a bunch of millionaire farmers, it's a success. Because actually, you know, it was very, very interesting. A couple of weeks ago, the University of Edinburgh came out with a statement saying we're thinking in terms of compulsory redundancies, we've got a really bad fiscal. And the Vice-Chancellor said one of the reasons for this is the Nix rise. Got no traction whatsoever. A couple of people in barbers outside the Palace of Westminster and all hell breaks loose. And I think that's quite a good protest for this government compared to what they could have faced. On social care, because it's starting to feel like a third rail. I would add to your question by saying the other thing is, over the years, we've ploughed money into hospitals, but not into GPs. So, I mean, some of our priorities, even within health, I think are questionable.
That's one of the things that's quite interesting, because the Wes Streeting big, principles underpinning the 10-year plan for health that we'll get in the spring are a sort of shift away from hospitals, the sort of shift into prevention, and the shift to digital, where his 3 big shifts that he wants to do. And then we get the 5-year target. And what's the 5-year target? It's a waiting list target, which means that what will be, and we're told that the Treasury is telling the Department of Health that basically that's your money, it's all having to go for this target, there's no more there, and that's what it'll be absorbed by. So you'll basically, through that one selection of the 5-year metric you will be judged by, in which you're going to say to the people, hold us accountable for what we do, you're basically skewing all of those other shifts and undermining your strategy, which should also have involved social care. I had a friend who told me, former Conservative MP, who told me he texted Wes Streeting shortly after the election because he lost his seat and he was looking for something to do, saying, you're having a Royal Commission on Social Care, Wes, can I be on it? And Wes has blanked him, which may be because he doesn't want to be on it, but actually he's not set it up either. So we're seeing nothing much on social care.
Say target, do you mean milestone? I'm just getting my language straight here.
Foundation principle.
We're back in Barberland. I think they're targets, even if they're milestones. They've got to be met by the end of
Thanks for those points. And I have to say, two of the things that have come in online have actually been answered. Farmers, you've given your view on that one, Anand, and main achievements of the new Labour government. Okay, let's move on, because this has been a global year of elections. We've mentioned this anti-incumbency. Obviously, it is very interesting that the US has voted for Donald Trump, and they've done so eyes wide open, right? No one can say the Russians duped them to vote for Donald Trump, or they didn't know what they're getting with Donald Trump, or he's misled them in some way about this or that. They know Donald Trump. and most of them voted for him. And that's not the only success, if you like, of populists around the world. So I suppose my thought is, my question is that, if you like, Trumpian populist wave, is that the defining schism, mainstream versus populist? Is that the defining political schism in Britain and the world? And is that populist wave essentially stoppable? Or are electors, are voters just so fed up and tired of people like you, and they just are willing to break things and see where they land? As indeed, by the way, I mean, if you look at the Argentina situation, Milei, a year in office, no buyer's remorse in Argentina, riding high in the polls, he's cut public spending by 30%, very painful. Argentinians, or half of Argentinians, say, thank God, we knew it was going to be horrible, but inflation's coming down, he's not printing as much money, and he's just not like the old one. So is populism a stoppable force in Britain and the world at this point, is my question for the next 10 points. Jonathan, have a go.
I mean, the answer to the final question, I'd say I have no idea. I mean, I think Milei is not a particularly good example, right? Argentina, what Milei is offering is a radical program. There's a lot of populist rhetoric, but that's not what he's not, because it's not relevant, aren't you, going around being nasty to immigrants or being racist. Or attacking trans people. None of these things are really top of the agenda in Argentina. What he's doing is a combination of a bog standard IMF fiscal adjustment program, which Argentina has done many, many times before, generally successfully in the first year. So that's not new. With something Argentina hasn't done before, which is a radical program of relatively free market deregulation, which even sort of relatively pro-regulation, progressive economists like me would say, in the Argentina context, is actually at least partly what's needed. But it's certainly not what populists are offering in other countries, right? They're not offering deregulation. And if you look at other countries, say, it seems, if you look at France, say, it's not obvious to me that what people are, they're certainly not voting for radical deregulation. Arguably, the populist wave in France is also a very conservative one. It's hands off our pensions, hands off state spending, etc. So there's quite a lot of variance. In terms of here, I'll go back to what I said before, which yes, yes, there is a significant constituency for reform, etc. here, but. And I'll defer to Paul and co, but all the evidence seemed to me to be it's not anything close to a majority. What most people want is actually what Starmer claims to be offering, which is decent growth and better public services. And if he delivers them, I genuinely don't think that Farage and co are anything like inevitable. But actually, you have to deliver them.
Anand.
I mean, I'd say yes, they are stoppable. I mean, firstly, you've got to if you look across Europe, you've got Spain, you've got Scandinavia, you've got a direction of travel that seems to be anti-Erdogan in Turkey at the moment. So it's not as if the sort of forces of populism are ascendant everywhere. And, let's not forget, we sometimes act as if Nigel Farage is measuring the curtains in number 10. I mean, Labour have got a massive majority and have just won an election. I think Labour are a bit guilty of this themselves, sort of talking up the threat of reform. So, yeah, I mean, what is undeniably the case, I think, is across the Western world, there has been, over time, a seeping of trust in politics that has made governing more difficult and made incumbency more difficult. And if you look at this country, if you look at, real wages over 15 years, it's hardly surprising in a way. I mean, the surprise is that we're not more militant in a way, given our economic performance over the last 14 or 15 years. But I think, yeah, they are beatable. And I think, Jonathan's right on this. sensible policies aimed at producing growth and improvement in public services, I think can.
So making the current system work much more effectively,
Yeah.
rather than breaking it all and saying, let's see what happens. Potentially, at the next election, given volatility that can see a massive Tory majority go to a Labour landslide, you can get that over the course of 5 years. Is the most important question in British politics whether Reform and the Tories eat each other at the next election, fighting in every seat and leaving Labour to win, even if Labour are unpopular in 5 years, or do Reform and the Tories resolve, if you like, the split on the right and become one party or an alliance, or one of them is so obviously the leader, they are the dominant side of it. But I just wonder whether that will be a very important
It's an
feature of the
important
next
question,
election.
absolutely. I mean, there are lots of other important questions. One is whether the government delivers.
Yeah,
the
that's
other is,
very important.
whether the SNP recover in Scotland is going
That's
to be quite important.
Yeah.
What the hell the Liberal Democrats do.
Yeah,
We
that's
did an
important.
event the other day where John Curtis was talking about the Lib Dems walking down a cul-de-sac at this election, and it was quite nice walking down, and you realise there's no way out when you get in it, because actually they've done so well. What strategy they've done. I mean, there are lots of moving parts, and I do think we obsess about Reform and Nigel Farage, and there are far more moving parts to our politics than
Okay.
him and them.
And Jill, a comment on that particular question, populism? I mean, obviously, it doesn't have to just be this country, because obviously there's a lot going on in France at the moment where Marine Le Pen didn't win the
So I want to throw in one other sort of trend that we've seen, and I think this was possibly most visible in the European elections, which are always quite good as a sort of barometer of public opinion, if not who people actually want to be governed by, because people across Europe seem to be increasingly using them like we always did, just to sort of have a go and send a comment. But I think one of the things that's really interesting was the fact that the big losers there in the European elections were not actually so much the mainstream parties, but the Greens. And I think the backlash against that, and I think we now have Reform agitating, just saying net zero's junk, just don't do it. We're just inflicting all this pain, uncompetitiveness on ourselves. I think it's a really interesting question about where the Conservatives now go on that, because actually ever since 1989 in Mrs. Thatcher's famous UN General Assembly speech, we've actually had more or less a sort of consensus on the need for action in the UK, if not precisely on what to do. Bits of stop-startism, but the Climate Change Act in 2008 passed with only 3 votes against. You can name the 3 MPs. It's a quiz question for the audience. But I think it's quite interesting to see where that goes. And I think that's emerging as quite a big battleground. We've seen that in the Netherlands as a very big factor there alongside immigration. So I think that's a really interesting question, because the other sort of populist gainers, if you like, the sort of lefty populists, were the Greens, who also did quite well in terms of votes, if also not in terms of seats in this election.
Anyway, Jonathan raised the question about when we say populism, we journalists get away with it, but there are a lot of different shades and different things. Millet is not the same as Trump, even though they might always be shoved in the same bracket. There is a kind of coherence issue about that.
And I didn't know whether Anand would count Modi as a sort of populist incumbent bit of a loser this year.
Yeah, actually.
Yeah.
I mean, he's a populist incumbent, in my opinion.
But he
And
also
so
did much less well in the elections than he was
He
expecting,
did really,
Yeah, I'm reluctant to use the word lose. He didn't do as well as everyone was confidently predicting 2 or 3 weeks out. That's definitely the case.
I just want to now ask another question. This is kind of related. This is not on the list you guys sent, by the way, so this one's your wild card question. And I'm going to use the term, I know people don't like the term, and I'm using it in a journalistic way, but is this the year that woke was slain as a political movement? James Merritt wrote a piece in The Times about Transgender Visibility Day this year relative to 3 years ago, and how, 3 years ago, the Bank of England were putting up flags and stuff like that. And this year, no one was mentioning it. And the Cass report, the Trump election victory, people on the left thinking we better simmer down on these kinds of culture issues because they don't seem to be helping us as a movement. I'm wondering whether you feel that battle or that kind of culture war stuff has been settled, and perhaps settled more on the to the favour of the Conservative side. Jonathan, do you want to take that?
I mean, I think the short answer is no. These are profound social and cultural debates which are going to go on. So I don't think they've been any settled. I mean, I think that, I personally would say that while there may have been some excesses, the backlash against transgender people has been pretty disgusting and disgraceful, and genuinely unpleasant. But that doesn't. But that particular battle is certainly by no means over, and I think it will carry on in various forms. More generally, I mean, obviously there was a lot of ridiculous silliness on the woke side, and some of that has subsided, and that's no bad thing. But I don't think that really is a sort of profound political or cultural trend.
Could you imagine Starmer taking the knee now? I don't think you could you? Or maybe you could.
Probably not, but that's just because of the optics rather than any of the any real underlying.
Yeah, he's not changed his view of the issues. No, that's actually an important point. Anand, on that one.
I mean, they still take the knee in football matches, not all the time, but it still happens. And I mean, it's partly dependent on events, isn't it? I mean, at the start of 2020, you wouldn't have predicted the death of George Floyd and the sort of Black Lives Matter movement. So, these things might be in abeyance. I think it's not surprising they feel in abeyance because we've just been through a massive cost of living crisis that has refocused our attention on economic fundamentals. I think it'd be very naive to say that debate has gone away because I think it would just take the right set of events and trigger it again, to be honest.
And on that, Jill, any views, comments?
Well, I think, you might want to ask Kemi Badenoch whether she doesn't see sort of some potential in running the woke agenda as a line of attack, because I would think if you elect Kemi Badenoch as your leader, you at least expect that there will be an element of that. So I think there will be some of that. But I do think actually sort of, Wes Streeting today has made an announcement on making permanent the ban on puberty blockers, obviously one of the recommendations in the CAS report, and getting a lot of grief there from Green MPs and people on the left of the Labour Party. So that theme runs through. On the other side, you're getting still huge numbers of issues about the integrity of women's sport, what that means. That's still a big issue, will be a big issue when we see who's the next IOC chief. That will be quite a critical part, I think, of Seb Coe's bid to do that. We've got the nurses in Darlington who are still sort of complaining and not seeming to get very far with their NHS management. And I do actually think that actually everybody has been done a huge disservice by the Scottish government blundering into the gender recognition thing, the UK government doing the same. Because if ever there was an issue where you really wanted some sort of royal commission to look at actually how do you navigate through the really legitimate concerns of trans people and the legitimate concerns of women who are worried about, if you like, fake trans or whatever, I think that would have been a very good way of doing something where you're actually weighing balance of rights and how that plays out in lots and lots of different things. And I think actually sort of allowing that to be reduced to a culture war has done nobody a service.
Okay, so we've discussed a lot. Any questions on these or other topics in the room here? I've also, anyone outside wanting to offer questions? Can someone give Evan a microphone that works? Okay, I'll hold it close to my mouth. But any questions? No. Yes, we'll take the lady there. Get the mic over there. Keep your hand up so the there we go. Lovely.
Thank you. I'm Doreen. Thank you for the interesting conversation. My question really is about the election of President-elect Donald Trump. Does it reset the entire conversation that we've had? That it's not just populism, but actually realism. This is really not just what the Americans are thinking, but the Europeans, including us here in the UK. The needs of young men to be recognized, the needs of just the average person to have the ability to pay for groceries, as Mr. Trump has recently highlighted. The entire conversation, has it just not changed because of his election?
I mean, there are lots of ways in which it might have changed. I mean, you mentioned some, but of course there are many other ways in which, go on.
I mean, I'd say a couple of things. I mean, obviously, inflation and the cost of living had a massive impact on the US election. And I think not being the incumbent and being up against someone who failed to distance herself from the record of the incumbent really helped him. But I mean, one of the things, so if you think about security, which is one of the things we're thinking about, I think one of the really irritating things about Donald Trump is he often says stuff that more mainstream politicians don't say that have a kernel of truth to them. So you take the debate about burden sharing and, you know, are Europeans doing enough for their own security? And Trump, one, was quite transactional about that. You lot aren't spending enough. Why should we be protecting you? And, you know, annoyingly enough for the Democrats, it bore some fruit because Europeans, hey presto, started spending more on defence. And there is an element of truth to what he says. So I think in some areas, not all areas, I mean, in some areas he just talks nonsense. But in some areas, he puts his finger on truths that haven't been discussed openly for a long time, and that resonates.
Thoughts about how Trump changed? I mean, it's a very big question as to whether Trump 2.0 will be any different to Trump 1.0, and whether, as many expect with Congress behind him, proper electoral mandate and a bit more experience, it'll be completely different. Jonathan?
I mean, just on the economics, I mean, I find that the sort of premise slightly difficult to take seriously, right? I mean, income growth for low-income Americans was pretty good under Biden, right? Wage growth was good. As for inflation, you know, the basic grocery basket takes a lower share of the average low American income household than it did when Biden was elected. It's just not true that there's been that people did very badly, especially low-income Americans did very badly under Biden because of inflation. They didn't actually. So I think, and certainly, you know, what Trump is offering on the face of it is more massive tax cuts for upper-income Americans and tax breaks for big businesses. So I find the sort of economic premise that this has somehow reset the debate, I mean, slightly difficult to buy myself.
When or if he
We'll
whacks tariffs on everybody, that might be very game-changing in debate terms, potentially.
I think the real, as Evan says, the real question is from an economic perspective, we should also remember Trump 1.0, there were some tax cuts for the rich and some tariffs, but it wasn't radically out of line with previous Republican presidencies in economic terms. So the question is, and we genuinely don't know this, do we get the same thing again, or do we get something quite radically different? Does he actually do what he's promised, which would have some pretty massive economic impacts, and in my view, quite damaging, particularly for low-income Americans? And if so, what are the political consequences of that?
I think it's quite interesting because there's a bit of a disjuncture between the sort of direct interest of the people who voted for Trump and actually a lot of the policies he's proposing, which we'll see worked out. But I think where you're absolutely right is that clearly Trump does manage to tap into this sort of more vibesy sort of thing of wanting a sort of, no holds barred alpha male character. I think it was really interesting how resonant his argument that there were no wars under Donald Trump, but there are loads of wars with this weakling Joe Biden, how much that played in, and clearly his determination to keep the US out of that as far as possible. So I think, if you like your leader looking like that, talking like that, saying these things, then you'll probably be sort of quite happy, even if it's not sort of benefiting your pocketbook, because the pocketbook didn't seem to work particularly for Joe Biden. I do think one of the things that does resonate inordinately with Americans are gas prices or petrol prices, and I do think that has really sort of, hit Biden because people all drive millions of miles everywhere because there's virtually no public transport.
In trucks.
In massively fuel inefficient cars, so or trucks or whatever. So I do think that's a really big issue. But I think this tapping in, but lots of women also voted for Donald Trump. I mean, so it's not just the sort of macho bit. So I think it's interesting to see. I mean, he is quite a long way away from, Keir Starmer. And when we are talking about the sort of rise of populism, we do have to remember that we elected Keir Starmer, who I don't think is,
No one's putting him in the same
that sort of quite
same
embodiment
bracket.
of populism.
I think we do just need to say something about Elon Musk. I mentioned him at the beginning. He's obviously been the biggest figure in the world this year, bigger than Trump. What I want to know is, I'm going to vote in the hall.
Oh, thank God.
How many of you think Trump and Musk will still be working together at the end of
Next month?
2025? Okay. How many of you think they will be still working together and friends? How many of you don't think they'll be working together and friends? You see, I think I would naturally think when you have two such enormous egos, it's hard to see how they reside in the same room. But, it's just a really fascinating one to watch.
But I do think, Evan, that Doge, get over all the conflicts of interest, the corruption potential and all of that, because someone was saying
Department of Government Efficiency.
The Department of
under
Government
Musk,
Efficiency, which isn't a department, so sort of advisory committee on government efficiency, Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy sort of working together to sort of cut things, is potentially very interesting. Some people have said the easiest thing for him to cut is NASA, and that then clears the way completely for SpaceX, and why wouldn't you do that? And that's a big saving, and we all know that you make big savings in government by cutting big programs, and actually it's not that much that the federal government in some ways spends. But I think it's really interesting to see, and I think to see what they do there, and I think one of the things that's going to be really interesting watching the US is where does policies that Trump pursues and do, how does that then sort of, if you like, reverse influence the political debate over here? We were talking last week, and Jonathan organised an event with a sort of economist from the US about Trump's plan for big deportations, which is really quite interesting, because if you start seeing the US successfully deporting lots of people, does that then have a sort of influence back on what people here reckon is the realm of the possible? Obviously, we don't have a land border that we can just march people to and say, hello, you're in Mexico now. But I think some really interesting things, if Elon Musk does find some radically interesting way of applying AI to whole swathes of government, and that would be super interesting to see. It's more interesting than the report from the Tony Blair Institute.
Brent Hoberman,
Heaven forbid.
Businessman, said to me, he said that is the most interesting experiment in government reform in the world at the moment.
And they're doing
let's all
it for
watch
us, so that's great.
all
They're
watch
experimenting
it,
on
and
themselves.
Maybe we will. And he did certainly cut 80% of the staff at Twitter. There have been lots of other things he did at
There's been
Twitter.
some quality issues.
But he cut 80% of the staff, and that's not the bit that's made it not function. He's...
So I have to say, at the moment, I get the impression slightly that Kemi Badenoch seems to think that Donald Trump is more popular here than he really is. She talks about him improving. She went out and met him in the first PMQ. She referred to him. And actually, I'm not sure there's that big an audience for that. You're quite right. If some of these policies work, that might change the debate. But at the moment, it's a relatively small section of the UK. Actually, it is a small section of the UK population that is in favour or likes Donald Trump.
I don't want us to run too much beyond 8 o'clock, and I want to ask about. I've got the notes here. This is the one that you put down.
God.
Talk me through some of the highlights from the UK and a Changing Europe research agenda this year.
God, this is embarrassing.
We really asked that.
Let me just start by saying I've not seen that piece of paper before now.
I don't know who wrote that.
So I don't know who did this, but let them start while I.
Talk me through some of the highlights, Jonathan.
Jonathan's going to say his report on immigration.
My report with Rob Ford on immigration. Well, I think we produced. I think Sarah Hall and I produced a report on the state of the UK economy at the beginning of 2020, which was very much aimed at sort of setting up the sort of exam questions for what we assumed would be a new government, and trying to focus not on the sort of very short term about will interest rates or inflation go up or down, but what are the big long-term challenge, what do you actually need to restart growth in the medium to long term around things like planning, infrastructure, and so on. And I think that has stood the test, certainly stood the test of time. And I think that, there is a sort of really big all-encompassing challenge on the growth agenda, which is that it's not so much that the state is too big or that we regulate too much in the UK, but over time, we seem to be doing it less and less well and less efficiently over a whole range of things, from planning, from building houses, to infrastructure planning and development, to competition policy, to tax policy, where this whole sort of thicket of, and you know, what you don't and cannot do in the UK context is, nor should you, is do what Milei has done in Argentina, is just have come through and say, well, we're just going to abolish whole swathe of regulation. It's not, would neither be desirable nor politically feasible here. But you have to do something, and I think there's a really big question of whether the British state, both policy makers, politicians and civil servants, is capable of that.
Interesting.
Okay, well, I'm going to segue directly from that. Thank you, Jonathan, for the intro. And since Anand forgot about this on his list of recent Brexit publications, our quiz last week, which I'm not bitter about, but Joel Rolland, Alex Walker and I wrote a report published in March called Brexit and the State, which actually was taking up exactly that. And was looking, it's 5 years tomorrow since the Get Brexit Done election. I'm sure PM is celebrating appropriately. Yeah, I didn't realise that too until I wrote a blog and I was looking for a hook about it. But what you realise is actually that in terms of the government, we've had this massive surge in civil service numbers. I mean, you know, it's a bonanza for bureaucrats, Brexit. I don't think that was intended to be the main Brexit benefit. But it's almost as though the British states had to sort of, you know, swallow a goat and it's sort of passing through and it's finding it quite indigestible. There are lots of places where this goat isn't properly, this is a metaphor I'm going to have to abandon, but where this goat isn't properly digested, where we've got sort of, you know, we're choking a bit on it, we haven't got the right capacity, we don't really know what to do with the new powers, you know, people don't like the system, you know, farmers who voted for Brexit because they didn't like the Common Agricultural Policy, by and large, really aren't that keen on the government's new farm payment scheme and things like that. There are all these places where, you know, second, third order Brexit consequentials are playing out all over the place. Brexit's sort of far from done, and it's imposed a sort of massive and distracting burden on the state. We did a really interesting Brexit Witness Archive interview, which we hopefully will be publishing relatively soon. And I hope he leaves this in, but the person we interviewed said basically after 2016, you know, partly because of COVID, partly because of the sort of energy price shock, but basically because of Brexit, the government actually just sort of gave up on every other area of government. And I think you're sort of seeing that we did this massive project or whatever. We weren't quite sure what we were doing it for. We certainly haven't sort of, you know, plucked loads of low-hanging Brexit dividends off the tree, though I love the passport stamps. But we certainly haven't managed to do that. We have added to the size of the state inordinately, and we haven't got very much to show for it.
Interesting. Okay, Anand, last word on UK and a changing Europe. Both the achievements
Not the last word.
No, well, the achievements of 24 and where it goes in 25, because obviously there's a funding question mark and the like.
I mean, on 24, I mean, it still amazes me how very sensible, very measured stuff that our research team do on Brexit is met with such hysteria quite often. You know, it's picked up by a daily, you know, we do this, Joel does this divergence tracker, and a couple of weeks ago, there's a screaming headline in the Daily Express because Richard Tice or someone close to Richard Tice probably has read it. And you know, it's a Brexit sellout. And one of the things I think we can be quite proud about is in this most divisive of issues, we just keep producing sensible, measured, empirical research-based stuff that lets everyone else go mad about the issue as they wish, as suits their preferences. So I think we've done a lot of Brexit stuff this year, and I'm quite proud of that output because it's still a big issue. It's, you know, it's changing so many aspects of our lives, from the economy to the nature of the state, and we're one of the few organisations that talks about it. Looking forward, So where we are at the moment is that the people who have funded us to date have said that from April they're no longer able to. That doesn't mean the end of UK and a changing Europe. We're looking at alternative ways of funding. And actually one thing I would say is in the next few months we've got a couple of absolute cracking good reports that are going to be coming out. One, which is in a way the sort of sidekick of the Brexit and the state thing, is on regulation, which is what are the post-Brexit regulatory challenges? And actually the more you dig into them, the more that you realise, bloody hell, there are loads of them. And, you know, reverting back to our core, our sort of specialist subject, if you like, in January we're putting out a big report because 31st of Jan is the 5th anniversary of Brexit that not only looks at what Brexit is meaning now, but looks back at the referendum, what happened, how this whole thing has played out. And we will be having an event in this room to launch that event on the 28th of January. So diaries out, everyone. So I hope to see loads of you there for that.
I don't want to end there. I want to overrun by 5 minutes. Any last questions in the hall? There are no more on. Yes, we'll take that one there. Just so, yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, this is as a last question. Does Labour hate the poor?
Discuss.
Well, on the basis that the winter fuel payments and the two-child benefit, which was very easy to have removed, and even the bus situation, all for very trivial sums of money in terms of the overall budget of the government.
Sorry, we'll just take a question from over here too. Sorry, there was a lady here who had a question. Keep your hand up so the... sorry, you did put your hand up earlier and then we got waylaid.
Allow me a comment first. I like the star on your Christmas tree.
Mm. Yes. That makes one of you.
And then just picking up on something you said previously about growth. Obviously, for me, the elephant in the room is that Labour, or Keir Starmer and his government, have ruled out rejoining the customs union and the single market. Now, with everything going on in the States and with obviously growth being so important, wouldn't that be the most easy thing to support and further growth in the UK?
I think we should park that question for now, because it is just after 8 o'clock. I would like a last word from each of our panel. Thank you for the... I'm taking those as comments or rhetorical questions. Really interesting, both. Is 2025 hopeful or fearful? Think about that. You think about that too. We'll do a show of it. Jonathan, hopeful or fearful?
I would like to be glass half full. We have a new government, and, you know, partly in reference to what the gentleman said about does Labour hate the poor. I mean, this new government is far from perfect, as we've discussed at length tonight. But for the last few years, we have a government which is combined performative cruelty in a number of respects with active incompetence across a whole range of policy areas. You know, and in my particular area, immigration and asylum, we had a government which in the pursuit of its cruelty, wasted huge amounts of taxpayers' money. Similar things happened in some aspects of policy with respect to disabled people. This government is far from perfect, but you know, I think they are actively trying to make things better, albeit not entirely successfully, and not by no means doing what I would want all the time. You know, there's a lot of things I would think they're doing wrong or I would do differently, including some of the social security things. But nonetheless, I do think that they are in general well-intentioned. They're trying to make things better. They have some good people. And so, on balance, I think we end the UK, at least, ends the year in a better place than where it started from. That's sadly not true of large parts of the rest of the world.
Okay, but Jonathan half full, glass half full. Jill?
Well, I can't possibly be gloomier than Jonathan, because that'd be a very weird position to be in. So I
What's
think
happened to Jonathan this evening?
I know,
Isn't it?
This is very. He must be about to go somewhere or something like that. So, yeah, I mean, I think one of the things that's really bedeviled British politics over the past past few years since 2016 has just been the sheer instability and stuff like that, and actually having a bit more stability and ability just to get on with things and not having everybody changing jobs every 2 seconds and huge internal fights all the time is a bit of a relief. I think actually one of the remarks that I think it would be quite good if Keir Starmer went back to was his remark about politics treading a bit more lightly on people's lives, because I always thought actually, you're in a better position if people don't have to feel that they need to be following the latest debates, however good it is. For us, however, it is good for Tim Shipman to write sort of 900-page books, the last of which I've asked for Christmas. So anyway, so I think that would be quite good. But I do think the big worry is the instability in the international scene. We've seen everybody, just now struggling to work out whether what's happened in Syria over the weekend is destabilizing or good. I mean, we've got rid of a horrible dictator, brutal dictator, but what will the new regime look? What does that do? Does this do things? So there are all these sort of threats. What's going to happen in Ukraine? All of these things playing out, horrendous sort of famines. And I think one of the things that has been very noticeable and characteristic of 2024, hopefully not to be repeated in 2025, is we have seen, regular and increasingly visible impacts from climate change everywhere. Speaking as someone who was in Valencia a week before the floods and looked to see where Porta was on the map compared to where I was quite shocked that it was the same distance out of the centre of Valencia as the very nice suburb where I'd been staying with friends, etc., and that there were lots and lots of people killed in those floods. So I do think that the global scene is more worrying, but domestically, at least let's have some stability.
Before I give Anand the absolute last word, in the hall, your two choices, hopeful or fearful. You're choosing which dimension you want to answer it in, domestic or international. But how many of you would say hopeful?
Oh, they're jolly lot.
How many of you would be fearful? Oh, it's about score draw. Last word, Anand, hopeful or fearful?
I'm sorry to say I agree with Jonathan and Jill on this, and I'm relatively optimistic domestically. And I think on the poor people and poverty question, I've got pretty high hopes for the child poverty strategy when it comes out next year. And I think I would assume that as part of that, the 2-child limit will be addressed, because it's egregious, and I can't believe they're going to try and tackle child poverty without dealing with that. So I think it's early days, but let's wait and see for that next year. But I share the concerns internationally. I really do. Whether that be the elections that are due, whether it be the state of French politics at the moment. I mean, the world is a very, very uncertain place at the moment.
Well, I have no views. I work for the BBC. But I would say I'm not fearful that we're going to be short of news in 2025.
No.
Can we thank our lovely panel for their reflections in 24? Well done, lovely. And thank you for joining in. Thank you for all of you watching at home. Thanks.
I was going to
You are losing your voice.